Terrific. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to meet with us, Dr. Mandel. We know you have a very, very busy schedule. I'm Yael Harris from Laurel Health Advisors, and my colleague is on the phone.
Hi, I'm Denise Fuson with Brilliant. I'm an analyst at Brilliant and have a background in health information exchange.
Excellent. It's great to meet you both, and please call me Josh.
Okay, thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Josh.
So the Department of Health and Human Services is charged in the Support Act to facilitate the effective implementation of Jessie's Law. And that is a law that was passed in 2018, named after a poor lady named Miss Jessie Grubbs, who overdosed at the age of 30 because her doctor inadvertently prescribed her a controlled substance, even though she had consented to share her history of prior substance use. So the act requires the secretary to develop and disseminate best practices for prominently displaying a patient's history of substance use in the medical record to prevent providers from prescribing opioids and other pain management medications. So stakeholders are actually trying to understand the technical implications of this and how to effectively implement Jessie's Law, along with identifying best practices and resources that could be used. We're also trying to identify key considerations and lessons learned. So we really would appreciate your insights and expertise to help us guide this endeavor and inform our efforts. Do you have any questions?
No, I mean, the framing is really helpful. I mean, I've got a lot of questions that probably would understand, what would be useful in this context, and, where are some of the options?
So, and that's what we were hoping to get from you. So that's fantastic. Why don't we start with just having you do a quick introduction of your background and your current work. And then we would love if you want to start the dialogue about some of the questions and discussion points.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good. So I'm Josh. I'm a physician and software engineer. I went right from medical school into the kind of health data standards and health interoperability world. So I've been in this space for a little over 10 years, generally working on projects that try to make it easier to access health information in a consistent and computable way. And that includes clinician-facing apps and tools that can integrate into EHR systems. And it also includes patient-facing access and APIs that you can use to get your own data, potentially from multiple different provider systems, into an app of your choice. So that work has involved international standards development with HL7. It's involved open source software development with the Smart Health IP project, and generally working with researchers, hospitals, health systems, technology vendors, app developers, a whole mix of participants in this ecosystem, trying to figure out, what are the places where we can provide some key capabilities. And so my day job today is at Microsoft Healthcare. I'm the chief architect there. And I spend most of my time working with the healthcare standards world. So I run a small open source development team at Microsoft that's focused on expanding healthcare standards for interoperability. And we work very closely with groups like the Argonaut Project and the Karen Alliance on these kinds of use cases.
Fantastic. So one of the questions I had is, what would you see as best practices for documenting substance use in the EMR? And, for now, is it the information that's captured, is it easily accessible to providers?
Right. So I tend to draw a pretty bright line between kind of the user experience and usability of these systems and the underlying data capabilities and data sharing APIs. And so for what it's worth, I probably won't have that much to say around the user experience. I tend to understand just enough of that domain to maybe have some intuitions, but mostly I want to make sure that we offer a set of capabilities that allow the various product vendors to really go deep and experiment with different user interactions and user experiences and figure out what works. There's a real science and art to that field, and a lot of it comes from user testing. And that's a subfield that certainly has been developed pretty deeply over the last even 10 or 15 years, and it's been an area that's been increasingly a focus of some of our regulations, like the EHR certification from ONC. That whole program now requires some level of user testing in addition to just developing the functionality, and that's all a really good thing. So when it comes to the actual process for documenting something like a history of a substance use disorder. There's many places in an EHR where that could happen. One context which is pretty commonly supported across EHRs, is the notion of a problem list or a managed problem list, where you're keeping track of a set of conditions that a patient might have that are relevant today. And this is an area of sort of clinical art, is how do you manage a problem list like this? You might have some historical information that stays in a problem list for a long time because it's useful context. You might have things that a clinician decides to take off of the problem list, not because they're not true anymore, but just because they're not relevant day to day. And a problem list that only ever grows can create kind of an intimidating and challenging situation for clinicians because they don't know what to pay attention to. And I think there's a lot of open design research here. How do you keep track of everything, but then don't overwhelm a clinician in the context of a given episode? And there's balancing there too. But all that said, it's very common to have some kind of active management of a problem list where the records never go away, but you have some sort of flag that says, well, these are the things on the active problem list. And those are the things that are commonly displayed inside of an EHR, and the kinds of things that are pretty widely shared in a number of interoperability scenarios. So those are, when I say interoperability scenarios, I mostly mean exchange patterns that are called out in the regulations today. So these are things like, maybe the simplest one is just a patient-facing after visit summary to say, hey, you just had this episode of care. Here's a summary of how things are, and that might include a current problem list. Similarly, a clinical summary describing just sort of your key and pertinent history, not specific to an episode, but just sort of wrapped up in one document, which is today often a CCDA. So it's a continuity of care kind of document. And then EHRs as certified products need to have certain capabilities around those documents. They have to be able to exchange them with other healthcare providers or data networks as part of these different scenarios, like referring a patient to an outside clinician or creating a discharge summary after a visit. And all those kind of have a common document format with common sections inside, and the problem list is one of those. And so for sure, if something like a history of substance use disorder is maintained as part of the active problem list, it'll sort of ride along those rails in the context of those summary documents. So all that is sort of a CDA-based kind of problem list angle. And then the other sort of parallel structure that I should for sure talk about is FHIR APIs. And so every certified product needs to have a set of FHIR-based APIs that include the data in the US core data set, which also includes kind of the actively managed problem list. Slightly different technical format, but same underlying substance, same stuff from the EHR that would show up in those different places. And those APIs are available for patient-facing access that's built into ONC's rules today, but they also tend to be available and pretty widely used for clinician-facing access as well. So data might be surfaced to a clinician-facing app inside the EHR using those APIs, and data might be surfaced to a decision support service using technologies like CDS hooks, clinical decision support hooks, using those same data models and same APIs. So there's a few different places in the interoperability landscape where something like a substance use disorder problem list entry might show up. And then outside of all that, outside of all the standards for interoperability, we can talk about behaviors within a given system. Where and how should this kind of information be flagged in the context of a clinical workflow? And there's a whole range of things. I'm sure I haven't thought of most of them, but they include things like flags on a patient record. So those are kind of top level things where you might just always want to highlight a piece of information next to a patient's name. Very, very challenging to figure out what belongs at that level in the general case, because there's a lot of really important use cases and a lot of potentially important information that you might want to surface that way. But if you start making a bunch of rules independently about what to put there, you wind up with this mess of a system where you've got 37 flags, but you can only fit 5 on the screen, and you have to scroll to see more, and then the important ones get lost, right? So that's like a huge UX and safety challenge. But that's, there are generally ways to highlight information at that level. But probably the most important capabilities inside of an EHR system are contextual. So the motivating case that you mentioned, which is the sort of tragic case history behind Jessie's law here, involved a piece of information that was missed in the context of writing a prescription. Or, I mean, I don't know if it was missed or it just wasn't attended to properly, but it sort of adds up to the same thing. Contextually, inside of an EHR, there are electronic prescribing modules and user experiences specifically around writing a prescription. And so those might be the workflows where it's most important to highlight this information. It could be relevant, of course, in other parts of the clinical workflow, but maybe that's the place where you would want to put special or specific emphasis. So those are just a couple of thoughts broadly about where and how information can surface. I'd love to get a sense from you about which of these things you've been thinking about or might be curious about, or what some of the challenges might be there.
So, I mean, I guess that's our question to you, is that, part of the legislation, or the legislation itself, but the guidance is that maybe we should consider, smart on FHIR, CDS hooks. And I want to hear from you how that might be operationalized, whether you feel that new data standards are needed, any changes you see. Again, the implementation is happening at the state level. So what do you see as any challenges related to that?
Okay, so I mean, consistency of implementation is always a challenge here. And it's been one of the places where ONC's leadership and guidance have been extremely helpful in getting different products on the same page. Managing these kinds of things state by state leads to, at the best, a bunch of different requirements that you have to try to navigate, but at the worst, conflicting requirements where you can't actually implement all of them, and not every healthcare organization exists neatly on one side or the other of a state line, and not every patient and their records exist neatly on one side or the other of a state line. So it creates real challenges to have different rules state by state, especially as those rules get detailed and contradictory. So, what I would think about, and the other principle for me is, I hate to say this, but I think it's critical to mention, it is possible to make things worse by trying to make them better. And there's a lot of failure modes here, but layering on more requirements in the clinical workflow can cause people to have simply less time to think and make good choices. And as different requirements come in independently from different groups, all well motivated, there's just always this risk that we can make things worse by trying to make them better. So I tend to look at these kinds of interventions as much as possible from a functional perspective. What are some core capabilities that we could add into these systems that would be useful here, but also in a cross-functional way for other clinical use cases, rather than having a whole series of one-off or point solutions. And this is the balancing act, to be sure. And sometimes a point solution is exactly what you want. So I don't want to be super dogmatic about it, but most of the sort of brainstorming I'll do is probably in this category. And I would say to really lean into the US core data profiles where they already exist, and US CEI version 1, which is part of the certification program that's in effect now. Every EHR needs to be able to deliver on this to maintain their certification over the next couple of years. That US core data set, version 1, includes problems, as I mentioned, and I think it's worth sort of a deep dive to understand where and how substance use disorder and related conditions would show up on that list. And even just from the perspective of saying, here are some examples, or here are some good practices to follow. The US core FHIR implementation guide sets the requirements for how that problem list can be used, but it basically points to a few high-level vocabularies. It says, pick a code from this coding system, make sure to populate these data elements like the date and the status. It doesn't provide super detailed guidance about, for example, how to represent substance use disorder. And I don't think we need a whole new set of profiles and a whole project that necessarily digs into that, but even having some examples to say, when you're following US core, of course you can represent substance use disorder as you can represent many other conditions on the condition list. Here's an example of how to do it. And for me, those kinds of examples, those artifacts have a lot of bang for the buck. They're very easy to produce. And software developers are generally pretty grateful for them. It's not adding a new pile of requirements, but it's giving them some clear guidance that they can easily follow. So I think that's all kind of low-hanging fruit to say, let's leverage these existing FHIR implementation guides and the existing certification requirements and just nudge people, give them a clear vision about what it looks like to do the right thing with them. And then the other area that I think would be very much worth pushing on as a general capability is the technology I mentioned earlier, clinical decision support hooks. And the really nice thing about CDS hooks is it provides a pattern for an EHR to call out to an external decision support service in the context of a specific workflow step. So you can have a CDS hook that just says, every time you open this patient's chart, call out to this service and see if there's any information to display, which is good. But for this use case, I think some of the more fine-grained workflow capabilities in CDS hooks are even better. So for things like electronic prescribing scenarios, you can say anytime somebody is about to write a prescription or sign a prescription for a given patient, there's a standardized way for that EHR to call out to an external service and say, here's the patient we're talking about, here's the prescription we're talking about. Do you see anything that we should highlight back to the clinician? And some of the really important aspects of that workflow are, first of all, that it's designed as a non-blocking workflow. So it's not popping up a modal alert and saying, please wait, and do you want to reconsider? But it's providing information in the context of what we call cards that can be displayed inside the EHR. And they can have different levels of kind of priority attached to them. But it's designed to sort of be there as auxiliary information without interrupting the clinical workflow. And then the other really important aspect of it is that these decision support services can get access to the FHIR API. So if we connect the dots, I'm writing a prescription in the EHR, I'm about to sign off on it, and maybe I'm prescribing an opioid drug. The external decision support service sees my draft order for an opioid, and it's coded with ARC's norm following the US core medication implementation guide. So that external service knows exactly what that drug is, knows what the components are, knows the drug classes involved. So it can say, oh, this is something that I care about in the context of substance use disorder evaluations. And then that service can also call the FHIR API and get the problem list for the patient. So it can say, we found that there's an example on the problem list of this specific substance use disorder. Bring those two things together. Hey, it looks like we've got an issue that we want to flag. And then it can return a card saying like, hey, you might want to be aware of this potential. So I think that's a really good pattern because it's based on data standards and it's based on these workflow or API standards that many different EHRs could independently implement correctly. And then one CDS service or a small number of CDS services could plug in to those various EHR systems. And the advantage there is you don't need to get hundreds of certified systems to each do this sort of very nuanced, domain-specific substance use evaluation. That code can be written by CDS developers who really specialize in those kinds of knowledge capture and application, and they can just return a card or not, depending on what the case is. So those are the things that I think would be like the most obvious places to focus.
That's really helpful. Are you aware of any strategies that might build CDS hooks into the process? I mean, you mentioned having them independently do that, but of course there's a lot of EHR vendors and also behavioral health. They may use products that are not, on the cert list just because, they're not standard EHRs. They have different information flow or they weren't incentivized in meaningful use. So how would you see this being operationalized across the nation, I guess?
So, I mean, this is complicated, first of all. There's not a lot of policy reach today outside of a certified EHR sort of product space. And I want to ask just a quick follow-up question. When you're thinking about behavioral health systems, you mean thinking about behavioral health systems in the context of electronic prescribing for these controlled substances? So yeah, this is tough. I mean, I don't know what regulatory hooks might exist, but even if a system like that isn't a certified EHR or doesn't contain certified modules, there may be regulatory programs that could bind to new requirements on them. Practically speaking, there's the issue of what does the technical solution look like? And then there's the issue of how can you encourage the adoption of that technical solution? I don't have any great suggestions on the encouragement piece there, just given the current regulatory landscape. I think there's others who probably have a better sense for me what the art of the possible looks like there. But I certainly have intuitions on the technical front. And then it's worth saying that at the very least, requirements around information blocking apply to all of these actors, and being able to share a full record set, being able to participate in data query networks. So even data that are being managed in a system that's outside of the certification program, like those data should still generally be shareable with clinical systems, including those certified systems. So, at least in that context, requirements that bound to the certified systems would be able to leverage data that could originate from elsewhere and be shared with them through health information exchanges or qualified health information networks, or some of these other modes of data access. And I think that there's at least the potential for just having some common ground on the development front. So CDS hooks is not part of the certification program today, but several certified technology vendors have incorporated CDS hooks, including in contexts specifically designed to meet other regulatory requirements. So we did a deep dive a couple of years ago in the Argonaut project on how to use CDS hooks to meet the PAMA imaging requirements from CMS. So those are basically the requirement that clinicians at the time of ordering an advanced imaging study, like a MRI or a CT scan, should be checking with an approved set of CDS guidelines to make sure that that's the appropriate test to order in that context. So we spelled out, here's a pattern for using CDS hooks to meet that requirement. The requirement did not come with any technical constraints. You didn't have to meet it using CDS hooks, but that turns out to be sort of a common building block. And it's easier to build that way than to come up with a whole new decision support system just for this one use case. So that's a pattern that I think could be repeated. We've seen some of the big EHR vendors roll out support for CDS hooks in the context of ordering and prescribing. And I think that even if these requirements don't bind to some of the behavioral health systems, just getting more acceptance of them inside of the certified products will lead to the creation, well, first of all, lead to more awareness. Second of all, lead to more tooling, including things like open source libraries for managing, parsing, working with these payloads. And all of that kind of lowers the barrier to implementation in other systems. So it's this chicken and egg game. And there's always just the question of how can you raise one side or the other a little bit to make it easier for the other side to come up.
So that builds into another question I have, which is you mentioned the PAMA. So as open source CDS rules or tools are created using FHIR hooks, how do you get EHRs to adopt? How do you communicate to vendors that this is available? And how do you get them to adopt? Because hopefully, even if it's not regulated, it would become like a snowball, and the more that adopt it, the more that would take it on.
I mean, I think that the best, well, it's a couple of channels I think that have been successful so far. One of them has been kind of community building within the health standards world. And we've for years run a series of connect-a-thon events within the FHIR community where we brought together decision support vendors, EHR vendors, specific use cases, and just help folks understand educational sessions at conferences, all this kind of community building and education, evangelism, you might say. And that's been pretty powerful, just in terms of making sure that the biggest players are aware. And then we've had participation from startups, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. But when a major EHR publishes documentation on their website saying, here's an open standard you can use to integrate decision support with us, suddenly small companies who are interested in building that kind of decision support say, oh, this is a pattern that's going to be really easy for us to adopt. We can get there quickly. It becomes a very natural fit. So, I think Epic deserves credit here, for example, for being one of the earliest production deployments of CDS hooks. They have public documentation on their website describing how that can be used, where it integrates, what the limitations are. And that's just a really powerful market effect, because anybody who wants to integrate with hundreds of major health systems has an on-ramp to do it that way using open standards. And, I'll say that there's also for sure a role in some of the federal support that we've seen, particularly around organizations like AHRQ, who have funded the development of prescribing guidelines and tools that use these specifications as an integration point. And I should say, I mentioned some of the benefits of open source libraries and tools, which I'm a huge proponent of, but I should also say that nothing about the standard requires that those libraries and tools be open source. And for companies that want to build a compatible system to meet their customers' needs, they can do it in an open way, they can do it in a closed way. As long as they correctly implement the APIs, those details are really up to them.
So would it be possible for CERT, the certification process, to mandate that you do this, but let you decide how to do it, for example? So, there might be an open source CDS rule that ARC puts out there, or Epic, and then others can use their own as long as they meet this requirement.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways that this kind of technology could land in our certified landscape, like as part of the certified EHR technology requirements in a future round. There's a path that tries to be very concrete end to end and say, here's the use case, here's the technology. You need to show that you can use CDS hooks in the context of this e-prescribing event in order to generate an alert of when this problem is present on the problem list and display it in a card. So that's sort of like the whole package. And in theory, that would be nice because you get real consistency from all the participants for this use case. I think in practice, it's very difficult to get that right because we just only learn about how to do these things effectively through implementation experience. And we realize there's a couple edge cases or things we didn't consider, and the standards need to be augmented or tweaked. And it's an iterative process. And when you harden those rules in a certification program, especially too early, you get very brittle behavior where you get vendors sort of building something to the letter of the rule in order to pass certification, even though it doesn't necessarily work for human beings at the end of the day. So I have a lot of red flags around that pattern. There's two ways maybe to approach it more cautiously or more incrementally. One is the introduction of a functional requirement. And so ONC did this really nicely back when Meaningful Use Stage 3 was first announced, I guess, around APIs. So there was a requirement that every system had to have APIs for what at the time was called the Common Clinical Dataset, CCDS. And that was a functional requirement because they didn't say what the APIs had to look like. They didn't say it had to be FHIR. They didn't say any technical standards. There was just, here's the data set you need to share. But they also said, we intend to ratchet up the rules and require FHIR for this in the future. And that was a great forcing function for industry to come together and figure out, well, how would we do this with FHIR? Let's work through those details. And that was kind of the birth of the Argonaut project that I mentioned earlier. So for me, that was a really good example, in part because it was focused on this common clinical data set that was pretty well understood. It was the same data set we had been using in CDA documents for a very long time. It wasn't trying to raise the bar on the data at the same time that it was trying to raise the bar on all these new functional API capabilities. It was taking a data set that we knew and then building APIs around it. That worked out really well. And I think you could do something similar for clinical decision support. You could have a functional requirement in the context of certification that said your EHR system needs a way to integrate an external decision support service at the point of care in the context of electronic prescribing, and that it needs to be able to return advice or suggestions to a clinician. You could say all that without even naming CDS hooks, but just sort of a functional descriptor that, yes, CDS hooks could meet, but other technologies might as well. And that would give industry kind of a clear picture of where things were going. And that would probably help draw a lot of attention to CDS hooks as a project that pretty much is working out of the box today, but at the same time needs more adoption experience to help really shake out any edge cases. So I think that would be one direction, and sort of naming CDS hooks as the intended future state, but just broadly a functional description. And that's probably my favorite, without deeper study would be that direction. But another thing that could be done would be naming CDS hooks without going super deep on workflow, but basically just saying, as part of the certification program, you could say EHRs needed to have some support for CDS hooks and at least one hook, which is to say at least one point in the workflow where these interactions can be done without going super deep on the use case, but just basically causing vendors to pay attention and do some implementation there. I generally just worry about any concrete versioned requirements of a specific standard, especially one that's showing up in certification rules for the first time. I think it's generally better to start with functional requirements, get the industry to help ship a version of the standard that they're confident in, and then locking in that version with a subsequent round.
That sounds fantastic. That's really helpful. So I just want to, are you aware of part 2 and consent?
I am aware enough to understand that there are concerns about data segmentation, and that in particular, data relating to substance use history needs to be treated differently in some contexts than the rest of a clinical record. I don't know that I'm aware enough to understand exactly what all the implications look like in the context of this use case.
So the second question that builds on that is, are you aware of DS4P, which is the ONC's data segmentation effort to support part 2? Yeah,
I am aware of DS4P. And I struggle with this concept. So, I mean, the way that I see it, DS4P is kind of the idea that different aspects of the medical record can be tagged with different privacy-related tags to tell you what kind of information it is, so that if all the different pieces of data can be reassembled or filtered in ways that are suitable to a particular use case or context. And those tags are, at least in my rough sense, kind of modeled after a military classification kind of concept, where you might say, well, this is highly classified data or sensitive data. And you might also include information about why, what makes it sensitive, what's the reason for the confidentiality concerns. And on paper, that's a really powerful set of capabilities. Or I shouldn't say on paper, I say in theory. That's a powerful set of capabilities to have in your electronic system. The challenge is, I mean, first of all, just for me personally, the idea of sensitivity is highly context dependent, and trying to say like this data is sensitive or this data is not sensitive. That's kind of the common core of DS4P, at least as I understand it. I reviewed a set of specs in the last ballot round for HL7, which was back in September. And I was pretty confused and concerned about the complexity of some of this. But at the end of the day, it all boiled down to, there were all these different axes of classification of what made something sensitive. But the one axis that was sort of the required axis was how sensitive. I'm paraphrasing, I might probably have that term wrong, but that was basically this sort of linear classification of how sensitive or how confidential. And I just don't understand how that is a viable descriptive model. I think sensitivity is always with respect to a context. It generally takes individual preferences into account. So, there's some individuals who might feel extremely sensitive about an alcohol use disorder diagnosis, not necessarily because of the broader social context, but just because of their family religious background and history. And they might come from a religious context where alcohol is a forbidden substance. And that same individual might not feel the same way about other substance use disorders, even though socially we might we might have a different hierarchy. These things are just personal, and the sensitivities are not like exactly independent, they're context sensitive. So I worry about that whole concept. And these are just sort of my personal worries. I'm not trying to like make a broader technical claim there.
No, this is really helpful, absolutely.
And then I do have technical concerns. So if you push aside sort of those personal worries about what does sensitivity really mean, technically, getting this kind of labeling right is an exquisitely complex challenge, which is to say every piece of information in the EHR would sort of need to have a label on it. And in order for the whole processing system downstream to act on those labels, and make the right decisions. And if the labels are wrong, the downstream components are going to make the wrong decisions, right? And so if you fail to label a clinical note as having relevant context for a substance use disorder, then it might get shared downstream in a context where you didn't mean to share information about substance use disorders. And labeling is exquisitely challenging because health information is this densely interconnected network. I might come out and include a condition on the problem list that says this patient has a history of substance use disorder. That's a pretty obvious case that hopefully any labeling system would be able to figure out. But maybe I used a local code in my EHR and I didn't have a standard code, or maybe the mapping table in my EHR was wrong. And so the wrong standard code was selected and the classification tool was brittle. It was looking for one of these 5 codes, but a new version of the coding system was released that added some additional flavors or nuance, and the classifier didn't know about that. So even that simple case of, is there a problem on the problem list, you could very easily get wrong. And then we get into all the auxiliary sort of hints. So maybe I have a lab test that reveals, and somebody was testing me for blood alcohol levels. Didn't say I had a substance use disorder, but even the fact that somebody ran that test might be quite revealing. Or maybe I have a clinical note that mentions something in the context of a provider visit that I had recently, where the healthcare provider just happened to be a clinic that specializes in substance use disorder. And even if it was just about my latest blood pressure, because they took my blood pressure as part of that visit and as part of a hypertension management visit here at my primary care doc, like, it's just so easy for information to leak. And so to imagine that we're going to correctly label everything that could potentially be of concern and then use those labels to drive workflow, I think it's a fiction. And I worry that believing in that fiction will lead to worse outcomes than accepting the reality that these data are densely interconnected and the safest thing to do is share if you're comfortable and don't share if you're not. It's a hardline stance. And I'm not saying there's no middle ground, but most of the middle ground that I'm aware of today is very hard to do right. And I just don't believe that we can.
So that somewhat answers, but I'm just going to put this out there. My next question, which was, what activities would need to be taken to actually implement DS4P?
I don't know. My guess would be that we'd want to focus on some very narrowly filtered view of the medical record to make this more tractable. So rather than trying to like label all the things that could be shared, first sort of cut out everything that involves any narrative text anywhere, cut out everything that it's just very hard to articulate, like what you'd have to do to really generate a lot of confidence in this strategy, but some pre-filtering just to say, we're going to leave a bunch of stuff off the table altogether. And we'll talk about then filtering specific information according to rules that we have a better chance of getting right. I tend to think that, that sharing models focused on time periods or sharing models focused on a particular source of information are a little easier to interpret for people. Like if I'm deciding as a patient what I want to share with an app or another provider, if I can do it based on source of information. So don't share my information from this substance use clinic, do share my information from primary care. That tends to be a little bit more sort of tractable and obvious, but especially as we have more densely connected query exchange or other exchange networks between providers, it becomes really important to carry along that provenance. So even if information is coming from my primary care provider, but it was originally supplied by a behavioral health clinic, and if I want to say only share information from my primary care provider, I want to be really clear on whether I include the information that my primary care provider has that came from outside, or whether I only mean information that was originated in that primary care provider system. So even that is just very challenging to get right. I'll say today in the health landscape for consumer access, the patterns of exchange that work best are basically, I'm going to connect this app to this healthcare provider and decide to share everything. And we've got a lot of more granular controls than that. We've got granular controls based on FHIR resource types. So share my medication list, but don't share my immunizations. That's something we can say. And we've been developing even finer grained controls in the context of the smart version 2 spec. So rather than saying share all FHIR observations, which is one resource type, we could say share all FHIR observations with a category of vital signs, but don't share the laboratory observations. And I think these are all good and useful, but at the end of the day, they can also lead to surprises where information has the wrong category or people just didn't understand what it all meant. So the safest model of sharing is if you're comfortable sharing everything, share. And if you're not, like, be careful.
That's really helpful. I mean, these are such great insights. I love how you think through all these different models. So thank you so much for this. Are there any questions you have for us?
I mean, I'm very interested in understanding more what the challenges of working with behavioral health systems versus working with sort of like EHR products look like. Like, I don't know the market that well. Do you have a sense of sort of how many are there and what does the distribution look like? Is there a small number of vendors that covers a lot of that market? What are some of the conferences or opportunities to kind of make change in that space?
So we're neither one of us is experts. I can start and then turn over to Denise. We were just speaking about this morning. So first of all, a lot of behavioral health providers, they were not incentivized under meaningful use. Yeah. So they don't use an electronic health record. You know, they're still back in the paper days. If they do use an electronic health record, it may not be using standards so that it can be shared with a provider, and they may not have a way to receive the data from a certified EHR, from an HIE, et cetera. Also, the EHR products that are being used. So if I'm a psychiatrist and I'm working in a hospital, of course, I have the whole EHR record, whether it's Epic, Centricity, I have that data. But if I'm a psychiatrist working in a small private practice or in a medication-assisted treatment program, I may not have access to that information, and I may use an electronic health record. So, but theoretically, then I don't have to follow certification standards. I would have to do my own programming to do this kind of alert. And there would be, you know, issues in terms of how is the data shared. And one of the big questions that comes up is the use case for Jessie's law is not prescribing an opioid, but there are other providers that are treating the patient as part of the network that the patient may want to know that information. So how does that flow work in terms of, you know, the social worker, the psychologist? They're not likely to prescribe an opioid, but if the patient wants to share information with them and it's not electronic, the EHR system from the large hospital, does it get shared with that individual? Do you want to add on to that, Denise?
Sure, I'll just add on to, as far as the behavioral health groups and specialists, there are so many across the country that, as Yael said, they don't have the larger EHR vendors, if they have an EHR at all, or a lot of it is the homegrown type. So they've got somebody who's a technical person that works in their practice that goes in the back room and helps them manage their systems to get reports and things like that out potentially. But there's also, you look at the fact that you can go to a dentist. If someone has an SUD and they go to a dentist, then how does that capture, and how does that dentist know if that patient did not share that with the dentist? That's one use case in particular that I think is another important, not just in the medical healthcare, but also in that dental field. That, you know, a lot of times when you have dental procedures, you have a lot of the pain medications prescribed because it's a painful procedure. So I just think that the information you've given us has been really, really helpful. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of, I think, standardization in the behavioral health space. No, I mean, not at all, due to those items that Yael had pointed out. So
yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And for sure, it's a deep set of challenges. I mean, a couple of thoughts, you know, based on kind of that view. One is there's clearly some overlap here between the capabilities of prescription drug monitoring programs and, you know, the ideas of doing lookup within a state database or more widely. I understand there's pretty mature systems in place for making these kinds of API calls, although not necessarily in an open standards-based way, and not necessarily in a context where the licensing makes it easy to adopt. So those are areas where, from a regulatory perspective, it might still be worth pushing to say, what does it look like to have access to a prescription drug monitoring program that's based on open standards? I would also push for patient access in that context, because some of the examples that you've shared with me are places where a provider might not be getting this information in the context of writing a prescription. This is maybe something I want to be able to share with others as a patient for my own reasons. And honestly, also just as a sanity check and a basic right for individuals. If there's a accessible electronic system with information about me in it, I deserve to see a copy of that, and that should be easy and straightforward for me to review, both so I can share it downstream, but also so I can recognize any errors and get them remediated. So this might or might not sort of be squarely in the middle of the kind of Jessie's law use cases, but I do see certainly at least a spiritual connection there to say, what are some of the building blocks that we should have in place that makes it easier for us to talk about and share this information when it's appropriate.
This is so helpful. I would say we've discussed all these issues and we don't have a resolution, so I appreciate you bringing them to our attention. We have spent a lot of time talking about PDMPs and whether they could be leveraged for this purpose. And do you think CDS hooks could be built into that, in that, they're not part of the medical, some places they're pulled into the EHR, other places you have to leave the EHR to access that data. Do you see there being any value to CDS hooks or FHIR standards for that?
Yeah, so I think that the low-hanging fruit for me would be FHIR-based access to the actual historical prescribing or dispensing data in a PDMP. I'm not super familiar with exactly what these systems track, but at least conceptually for me, they would have information about prescriptions that had been written and about fulfillments of those prescriptions where pills or medication had been dispensed. And those are data types that FHIR has really good models for. And conceptually, at least, PDMPs could host FHIR APIs for these things, and they could make them available for clinician access under an appropriately authorized set of APIs, and they could make them available for patient access. So just the same way that I might sign into a healthcare provider to see the records they have about me, or the way that I could sign into a state public health system like an immunization registry and see the data that they have about me, I should be able to sign into a prescription drug monitoring program and see the data they have about me. And so the smart on FHIR APIs would be a very natural connection point for those PDMPs to implement. It provides structured data, and it provides an approach to authorization so that individual users can sign in and choose which apps or which parties to share their data with. So I think that would be a very natural fit in terms of making those data available and interoperable. And then on the second question, or it might have been your first question, but the one I'm thinking about second, which was CDS hooks integration. I see benefits and I see risks. So formally speaking, CDS hooks provides a way for an EHR to call out to a decision support service. If that decision support service happened to be provided by a PDMP system, that could be quite valuable because it could loop in the data it had about a patient together with the data about the prescription that was being written and any other EHR problem list type information. And it could use that whole package to make a set of recommendations. And that's really powerful because maybe the EHR hasn't yet incorporated information about substance use disorders or histories into the problem list, but the PDMP knows this is somebody who's just, on the highly exceptional end of the opioid dispensing curve. And it could provide that information in context. I think the risk there, at least the way I see it, is it also consolidates a lot of power in that one set of providers. If they don't have to focus on sharing the data they have, and instead they can make a moat around that data set and then offer services on top, then their data set becomes a value add for their services. And that can create some challenging kind of business incentives. So for me, if the data are locked up, then it's a pretty dangerous thing to build decision support services on top because, roughly speaking, my personal view, it starts to feel a little unfair. But if the data are openly available and the data holder can build services on top, that's a much more comfortable place to be.
That's just incredibly helpful. I really appreciate it. So we're coming to the end of time. Is there any other questions that we didn't ask that you think we should ask? And also, are there any people that you might suggest we speak to help inform our efforts?
I mean, so there's been a super interesting set of topics that I haven't thought about nearly deeply enough. So I appreciate the background and talking through this. In terms of other folks that it might be worth talking to on this front, I mean, certainly from the sort of AHRQ side and folks who have gone deep on opioid prescribing guidance in particular. You know, I know John White is somebody who supported a lot of this work. Bryn Rhodes on the technical front has done a lot of development around some of the decision support standards. They might be great folks to talk to. On the PDMP and data access side, Anish Chopra might be a good person to talk with around, you know, incentivizing folks to make data available. Those are a few suggestions.
Those are fantastic. Those are really, really helpful. Thank you so much for your time. I really, truly appreciate it, Dr. Mandel.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's been fun.
Thank
Yeah, it's
you.
been a pleasure for us as well. Thank you and have a great
Absolutely.
day.
You too.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.